Awesome. Thumbs up if you can hear me. Cool. Thanks. All right, let's get started. First of all, just want to say thank you for doing this debate. I look forward to it. Second of all, I think my first speech is really just going to be spent a lot on definitions and framework with probably 1 point of positive matter. My second and third speeches, I'll introduce the majority of my positive matter, and I think what will be the substantive debate. That way we can get into the details of examples and stuff like that. But first, some framework and definitions. So definitions, I think really the only word I have to define in this resolution is the word obsolete. What does that mean, and what kind of burden does that put on pro and on con? So here's two definitions of the word obsolete I have. The first one is from Merriam-Webster, really credible source. It says no longer in use or no longer useful. Second definition I have is of a discarded or outmoded type, out of date. Now, I kind of wanted to introduce a general, more common man definition to kind of see if you would agree. That way we can kind of stimulate more like actual competitive debate. So here it is. My more common man definition is this, basically, that the UN can no longer currently fulfills its purpose to a satisfactory measure, aka it has failed the global community in regards to the vision statement that it set out at its founding. And now there's two reasons why you should prefer this definition. The first one is that it allows for us to discuss the broader principle behind the resolution and how the UN has really failed or fulfilled its vision. And then your second reason to prefer this definition is that it gives us an immediate access to the discussion of the examples in which the UN has failed or has fulfilled that definition. So we can immediately start talking about examples and kind of the vision statement rather than talking about whether or not the UN is still, viable in the terms of the definition of obsolete that Merriam-Webster gives. So, all right. So what kind of framework do I want to lay out for this round? The framework that I really want to lay out is that I don't have to prove that the UN currently fails in every single scenario. I just have to prove that currently it is unable to fulfill its vision statement or unable to succeed in pretty much any endeavor that it has done regarding humanitarian, economic aid, or any kind of political discussion that it fosters between nation states. And now that's kind of the burden that I put on myself. And so, contrary, on the con side, I would say that I don't want to put the burden on con. That you can prove one example where the UN is relevant and therefore you win. So the UN's purpose, as set out by the Charter, is maintaining worldwide peace and security, developing relations among nations, fostering cooperation between nations in order to solve economic, social, cultural, and or humanitarian international problems. That's the biggest one that I'm going to focus on today is worldwide peace and humanitarian international problems. And I'm basically going to limit this discussion to the past 12 years because I think obsolete implies that it was useful and now it's not, or it has been useful and now it's not. It doesn't really have a use in the modern world today. So if you want to bring up examples, please tell me, give me a good reason to prefer why we should delve back into past 12 years. The reason why I did 12 years was because that's really when the Arab Spring kind of started. And that's when the UN really started experiencing a lot of geopolitical problems.
All right, sure. So let's get into the idea about your definitions framework, and then we'll go on past 12 years. So starting off at the top, I would say the most important definition to use is, in fact, this idea from Merriam-Webster about whether or not it's useful. And the reason for that is we're not going to look to the mission statement of the UN because the mission statement of the UN would put an unfair burden on the UN themselves. For example, the United States federal government is to protect the citizens of our country. There are times where the federal government doesn't do that. But that doesn't mean I would call the federal government obsolete. Insofar as what I would say is that the reason that you consider something obsolete is whether or not it's useful. Thus, your burden in this round is to tell the audience whether or not the UN is useful or not. If the UN is taking action that isn't helping the common good, then they fail. If they don't, then obviously there's no need for the UN. But what I would say is that this isn't going to really be a debate about whether or not they're fulfilling its vision statement, because lot of sense, the vision statement itself is to provide worldwide peace and stability. I would say that it's unfair to say that the UN has to promote worldwide peace and stability because that's obviously hard to do. But I would say if that they're improving worldwide peace and stability, then the UN is fulfilling their duties and thus they're doing things that are useful in our current time, so not being obsolete. I would agree that the past 12 years is a fair assessment. I would say that we can do anything around 12 years. The Arab Spring is a reasonable example. And in the debate today, I guess because we're going to get into substantive matters later, I'm going to break down the UN into three of its components that are really important. The first is their subgroups, which are going to be things like the UNODC, which is the Office on Drugs and Crime, the UNEP, Environmental Protection Agency, and so forth, so on, subcharters within the UN. The second that I'm going to focus on is the United Nations Security Council, which is the only council within the United Nations that takes actions that are considered immediate and prompt. And those are comprised of 15 nations, 5 of which are the P5 countries who have veto power. And then the third thing that I'm going to discuss in the UN is NGOs, which are directly funded, majority of it, which are funded directly through the UN. So with the use of the subgroups of the UN, the United Nations Security Council, and NGOs, I'm going to prove why the UN is in fact useful in its current day and age, is promoting its vision statement of helping to maintain worldwide peace and stability, and showing why the UN has not failed and will continue to be important for decades to come.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll bite that one. I'll totally agree with the Merriam-Webster definition. My only problem is my opponent gave no engagement with my reasons to prefer. He basically, which I gave too. He basically just said Merriam-Webster's better. That's fine. We'll go with that one. And then he put a burden on me that said they are or aren't helping the common good. That's totally fine. I'll accept that burden. Let's go into my first point of positive matter, which basically goes into refute the UN is improving the world. So my first point of positive matter is the failure of the modern peacekeepers in the global community. Let's look at a bunch of examples. My first example is that UN peacekeepers have not only been ousted as untrained, but they have more importantly been held hostage, spread disease in common places, and stood by while civilians have been killed and raped in front of them. Here's a couple of examples. The first example is in the Central African Republic after the 2010 earthquake. They sexually abused and harassed civilians, and this was caught by multiple human rights monitors. I have the link. I can post it in after the debate. Second is that UN peacekeepers have been held hostage in Syria, Sudan, and Rwanda. Third is that they failed to confront the Southern Sudanese generals about the use of child soldiers throughout the Southern Sudanese conflict. Fourth, they did not prevent or even deploy peacekeepers in Aleppo when the genocide in Syria was going on. Fifth is that they didn't prevent or even deploy peacekeepers when the Russian invasion of Ukraine was going on. Sixth, I would encourage you, as the audience, to go Google the Darfur conflict, the Southern Sudanese conflict. There have been 55 civilians killed and 2.2 displaced refugees as a result of this. And peacekeepers have done absolutely nothing to prevent the rape and murder of women and children in South Sudan. And they've done nothing to prevent the conflict as a whole. Gerard Prunier, who's a scholar specializing in African conflicts, argued that the world's most powerful countries have limited themselves to expressing concern and demand the United Nations to take action. The UN, lacking funding and military support of the wealthy countries, initially left the African Union to deploy a token force without a mandate to protect civilians. Now, my opponent could come here and say, look, the UN isn't supposed to solve the problem. They're supposed to give the nations an opportunity to discuss and solve the problem. That's exactly the point. That's exactly why the UN is obsolete, is because it can't do anything in regards to the Southern Sudanese or Syrian conflict. Those two examples are examples exactly why. In Southern Sudan, there was an instance where a UN peacekeeping force was 1 mile away when Southern Sudanese militants were raiding an entire town and raping the women. And they were aware of what was going on, and they did absolutely nothing. In that sense, they're not improving the world. They're simply standing by while something goes wrong, while something happens. And again, the death toll, and that was 2 years ago in Southern Sudan, is over 50,000 civilians, innocent civilians dead and 2.2 million replaced. If the UN cannot stimulate action to solve the problems that it claims to be founded to solve, then I think it's without question in today's culture really obsolete. And I don't really think that we should consider it as a peacekeeping global operation.
All right, so I'm going to start with my first contention is the UN promotes development. Since the 2000s, the work has been guided by Millennial Development Goals. Virtually all funds for the UN development assistance come from contributions by multiple countries, and we've helped improve 170 countries with 4,800 projects to reduce poverty, promote good governance, address crises, and preserve the environment. The UN's Children Fund works in 150 countries, primarily on child protection, has increased the amount of educational levels in over 45 countries since its inception in 2000, and the World Bank, chartered under the UN, has approved grants in the third world countries of 12,000 projects in more than 170 countries. Next, this is going to go, my second contention is the idea of African development. Since the inception of the 2001 African Heads of State Plan by the UN, we've seen an absolute increase in the amount of framework for the international support to Africa. The continent receives 36% of its funding through UN system expenditures for development, and it's the largest share of Africa receives out of any other private organization or international donor. Insofar as UN agencies have special programs implemented in Africa to promote development, we see unique inherency to why Africa is, or why the UN is important in Africa. Next is the responsibility of tourism. International tourism arrivals reached 1.1 billion in 2014, generating 1.5 trillion in exporting earnings. The World Tourism Organization, the UN agency responsible for the promotion of responsible, sustainable, and universal access to tourism, has helped garner market knowledge, promote competitive and stable tourism policies, fosters tourism education and training, and works to make tourism a tool of development through technical assistance projects in over 100 countries since its inception in 2006. Insofar as what we see with these three cases focusing on development, African development, and tourism, is that overall the UN implements programs in over 150 countries that go towards increasing the level of infrastructure, increasing the level of education, and ensuring that people are educated around the world. Now, before I go into my next contention, I'm gonna talk about this peacekeepers. First, I'm gonna do an overarching overview. This debate is not going to come down to us listing the things the UN has done good and the things the UN has done bad. This is going to be a holistic argument on whether or not peacekeepers as a whole are effective. What I would say is that listing examples of when peacekeepers were not effective is like saying, well, the United States has a police force and the United States police force kills people. I know that. But that doesn't mean that police as a whole are not beneficial to upholding the values of American federal government and protecting its citizens. So what I would say as we go throughout the round is that I will provide the evidence to show that peacekeepers as a whole are doing the job of promoting their vision statement of the UN, rather than us just saying, well, peacekeepers have failed a couple of times.
Awesome. Okay, so let's get into the analysis that you brought up. So first of all, you talked about there's over 4,800 projects regarding, environmental protection and stuff like that. And I would just posit to my audience and to my listener group that my evidence about the lives lost from a result of peacekeeper malfeasance actually outweighs my opponent's first point. His second point, he talked about how the World Bank has sponsored, various economies. I'm going to bring up my second point of positive matter to directly refute that. My second point of positive matter is that the funding in the economy of the UN have actually drastically decreased since its founding. The IMF and the World Bank and the WTO are basically ceding to larger geopolitical players, and that's from Frank Viter, who's a senior political analyst at the Heritage Foundation. And he basically and goes through several reasons and analyzes why the World Bank basically doesn't have a say in almost anything that happens. Why? Because they outsource it to the African Union, they outsource it to the Syrian National Coalition and to the Arab League. That's geopolitical actors. All right. Third of all, he talked about African development, and this is not true for three reasons. First of all, it's not true. His point is not true. His second point of positive matter is not true because, as pointed out before, the UN cedes a lot of their actions to the African Union to try to kind of offload the work that they have to do. Second of all, a lot of that aid, a lot of that food doesn't actually get to the local populace because of the drug lord kind of vice grip that local hegemonic actors have over the civilians that can't do anything. And third of all is local governmental corruption. A lot of that aid that the UN sends doesn't actually reach the civilian populace. So it's kind of a good picture that you can paint, but in reality, it doesn't actually help the individuals on the ground. So then he talked about this tourism point. I want to go ahead and turn that. The tourism point, he fosters tourism in a lot of nations. And what people are realizing now, what the UN is just starting to realize, is that tourism is actually horribly disadvantageous to nations. Why? Because it fosters like a short-term economic boom where you get a lot of tourists, they like love your country and they come in. But the problem is when we started realizing that ecotourism was a thing, we started realizing that tourism itself was bad. Why? Because tourists are very negligent of the environment or the culture or the standards that happen in a local community, and they don't know what to do. So they actually end up being a detriment to your entire country. Third of all, do we want tourism in these African nations? No, we want ecotourism, not just normal tourism. Your tourism point has no impact, essentially. And then basically my opponent went on to talk about how we want to develop this holistic, mentality about the peacekeepers. And that's fine. I'm totally willing to bite on that argumentation and to say, sure, we should look at a holistic, take of the peacekeepers. I would like him to show me through the most valid points of conflict in the world today, namely Syria and South Sudan, where the UN could intervene, why they haven't, and why if they did it would work. He can show me little mom and pop stores that they stop in central Ukraine, but that's not gonna be the real holistic argument we're looking for. The UN as a global organization should intervene in global conflicts, and it should be effective. Otherwise, it is unable to do so, unwilling to do so, and therefore obsolete.
All right, so that's going to lead directly into my second point about the United Nations Security Council. And because you just talked about Syria, we can address that. So on September 27th, less than 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Security Council took preemptive action on addressing the Syrian conflict and garnered Geneva peace talks for the region. I'll directly read from the source itself that says the situation in Syria is at a high risk for backsliding. A special envoy from United Nations Security Council urged government intervention and restarted peace talks. Essentially, this goes to the overarching argument that the UN Security Council is the most important aspect of the UN and is the most important reason why they are useful in promoting their image. A couple of conflicts that are occurring right now that are changing daily is, for example, the North Korean conflict. The most important piece of action taken by any country, including the United States, China, and South Korea, addressing North Korea's nuclear capabilities was in fact the United Nations Security Council, who put a new round of sanctions on North Korea and immediately decreased the amount of threat by North Korea. There hasn't been a single nuclear missile test since the sanctions have been put in place. I would say that because at the beginning of the round, we agreed we were doing what's useful, the North Korean missile threat being evaded directly as a result of the UN Security Council is one of the most important reasons why the Security Council is important. But the next reason is because the United Nations Security Council can take preemptive action before any other agency is able to because of the fact that they have international legitimacy. If any other country wants to take action, for example, in Africa or in the Middle East, they would need to do that unilaterally through their own country's means. But the United Nations Security Council allows 15 countries to work together and use the resources provided by the UN to then go, in fact, and evade that threat. One of the biggest reasons why we stopped threats in the Arab Republic was the deployment of UN peacekeepers directly done by the United Nations Security Council. Now, I'm sure we can both find evidence on peacekeepers both killing civilians and not. But I would have a big problem with saying that economic benefits are outweighed by the killing of civilians by UN peacekeepers. And the reason why that is because on a general scale, the amount of economic development increasing by 1% leads to a decrease in the overall homicide rate in Middle Eastern countries by 2.6%. That's really important because the overarching analysis found by the Heritage Foundation says the most important thing to keeping people alive in a country is to increase economic development. So on net, I would say the UN does the best job of promoting economic development. And if you're going to say that lives are important in the round today, then I would say the best way we do that is through, in fact, promoting economic development, which happens as a result of UN-funded programs in both the UNODC and the UNEP.
Awesome. Okay, so let's start at the top. So you basically brought up the UN Security Council as one of your prime kind of advantages for why the UN actually isn't obsolete. And I have 3 reasons why that's basically a turn in my favor. First of all, the UN Security Council can only propose resolutions. They can't actually propose unilateral action, and member states don't have to contribute. Second of all, this is many, and you gave the example of Syria, how they passed a resolution. This is many, many, many years too late, thousands of bodies too late, and millions of refugees too late. And let me explain why. This goes into my third point of positive matter about how the UN has a faulty mechanism and why that faulty mechanism makes it obsolete in today's world. The UN Security Council is made up of 5 permanent members who are all the victors of World War II, right? All of them at any given time over any given resolution have a veto power. The reason why the UN is not able to accomplish anything in Syria is because Russia would veto it almost every time, and they were backed by China too. And so the UN can't get anything substantive done. It can't get anything done in regards to totalitarian regimes because Russia or China is just going to veto it. So the fact that peace talks came is completely non-unique and thousands of bodies too late and many years too late. All right, so let's go on to your point about the North Korean conflict. And I have 3 points to refute this. First of all, that's just factually false. They've tested 2 nuclear tests since that time, since that sanctions came up. And second of all, they really don't care about the sanctions. Their people are starving anyway. Kim Jong-un isn't the one that really cares about sanctions. He's gonna shoot down South Korean planes and launch missiles at South Korean warships as long as he's there as their leader. And they've been doing that for the last 10 years. Okay, so let's go to your holistic argument. You said basically, and I like the analysis you gave on this. You said, look, we're both going to bring up examples, and that's not the point. That's totally true. I can bring up a lot of examples, like I did in my second speech, about how UN peacekeepers have raped and killed children, and you can bring up a lot of instances in which they've protected a lot of people. That's not the point. The point is to show, at least that what you said, that they do more good than harm. And here's the problem with that. I have two problems. Number one, I don't think they've actually done that much good. I would encourage you to give examples. And number two, I think the bad, even if they have done a lot of good, the bad that they've done outweighs that and makes them obsolete in today's world. If they're going to do more good than bad, then I need to see examples. And if they can't do more good than bad, then they're obsolete. The UN post-World War II was established as the League of Nations first, and that was dismembered, and then the UN came out of that. And they were basically established as an anti-genocide chamber, as a way for nations to dialogue before genocide happened. And what are we seeing in today's world? They can't do that. They're still letting genocide happen. They're still letting thousands of civilians be killed. Refugees go all over the nation, all over, the civilized world, and they can't step in to do anything. Why? Because they're obsolete. Because the UN peacekeeping force doesn't work, and the talking that they're doing in their chamber certainly also doesn't work.
I think the most important for me to address right now is this idea of UN peacekeeping successes. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of crises that were evaded as a direct result of UN peacekeepers in the last 12 years, as we agreed on it. First is the 2006 East Timor crisis, which was directly as a result of two different missions. First was the mission of support in East Timor, and the second was the integrated mission in Timor-Leste. Then we have the United Nations Assembly International Civilian Support Mission in Haiti, which was one of the reasons that we were able to train the Haitian National Police, which is a direct result of UN peacekeepers, because they're the only body that was able to effectively train Haiti, and then as a result led to the evasion of the crisis within Haiti. Then in Cote d'Ivoire, we saw the Ivorian Civil War crisis evaded as a direct result of UN peacekeepers intervening in that mission itself. And then the last example I'll provide is the mission in Kuwait. Because of the fact that there was a strong war within Kuwait itself, the UN peacekeepers were able to evade that conflict and effectively train their military to show that to effectively allow for more stability in the future. And that's going to lead to one of the impacts of the arguments, and you can turn the peacekeeping operation, is because peacekeepers are not expected to resolve conflicts immediately, right? Conflicts have a lot of different factors, including regional stability, conflicts between two different nations, as well as internal conflicts. I would say that at best, peacekeepers' job is to reduce the amount of conflict. Giving you 6 different examples of when peacekeepers was the reason for why a conflict was evaded just shows the power of peacekeepers. But the most important idea is that when peacekeepers come into a region, they provide training for the military and for the police forces, like you saw in Haiti or Kuwait or Cote d'Ivoire, which shows that later on, these countries are able to promote stability. And you can directly link that to your framework of showing the vision statement of promoting worldwide peace and stability. Because when UN peacekeepers intervene, not only do they have chances of diminishing the conflict, but they also set up the impact of being able to promote future sustainability by allowing the military and police forces to be more trained than had UN peacekeepers not intervened at all. Which then I would raise the point of saying, instead of saying why UN peacekeepers have killed civilians in the past, we have to evaluate the fact that UN peacekeepers have stopped conflicts, which would have resulted in thousands of deaths. But more importantly, we have to see the idea that UN peacekeepers allow for future civilian lives to be protected because of the fact that they're upholding the idea of stability. The next most important argument we're going to talk about is the Security Council. In the last 10 years, the Security Council use their veto power less than 5 times per year. I would say they pass more resolutions than they do by 10 times than the amount of times they use their veto power, which outweighs the fact that even if certain countries can use their veto, the UN Security Council does far more with the action its ability.
Awesome. Okay. So the whole round basically falls down to 2 issues: Security Council and then the peacekeepers. So I'll go in order, and then hopefully my last speech I can provide some impact calculus for why my argument's that way and why my calculus actually leads to a vote in favor of pro rather than in favor of con. So let's look at the 2 arguments. First of all, he brought up 3 examples where peacekeepers have succeeded, and I'm going to address those. First of all, he brought up the East Timor crisis, and I'll cede that to him. Sure, that was a very small, enclosed environment in which there were very few, if not no, militants that were actively available available to fight. Second of all, he brought up the Haiti conflict, and I like to term this because directly after peacekeepers were deployed in 2010 after the earthquake in Haiti, they spread an epidemic of cholera while they were there, in addition to not really helping anyone. So this peacekeepers are effective because they prevented conflict in Haiti is really non-unique. And then third of all, he brought up the mission in Kuwait, and I'd like to respond to this in two ways. First of all, the mission in Kuwait wasn't really a conflict so much as it was a follow-up to the aftermath of the U.S. inserting itself in a colonial style into Kuwait. Kuwait wasn't going to really undergo any sort of really military conflict after the U.S. did what it did because people were too afraid. So peacekeepers coming in on the coattails of the U.S. and saying, look, we're here and we're solving things is actually non-unique also because they really didn't do anything that didn't really stop any conflict. Peacekeepers, as per the UN's vision statement, are supposed to come into areas that have a humanitarian or a military crisis going on, are able to stem that, save civilians, save lives, etc. Now, I agree with my opponent that we're not here to debate examples. I could bring up a new example. I've got plenty right here, but that's not the point. The point is the impact calculus, right? So I would ask you to hold my impacts, my lives lost, and women and children whose quality of living are downgraded to be overvalued over the small examples that my opponent has given. So in the remaining seconds, let's go into the Security Council. I have two responses to his kind of 5 vetoes per year argument that he gave. The first one is that all the it doesn't matter how many vetoes are used. All that matters is one veto in a time of crisis. One veto in a time of crisis can completely obliterate any kind of forward-moving progress that the UN would do. That's why it's obsolete. Second of all, these vetoes, even if they're not used, these are resolutions that no state has to follow. The UN cannot obligate anyone to follow any of these resolutions, which means completely obsolete and actually getting nations to do what it wants them to do or what they need to do. This is why, at the end of the day, you should vote for the UN as an obsolete force in theory and in practice. Because in theory, if something big came up, a nation would just be able to stand there, do nothing, or a UN Security Council member could veto it, which means in theory, it's obsolete, as well as in practice, it's also obsolete. And that's why I should.
All right, so with my last speech, I'm going to basically break down the 3 voters. First is the idea of economic development. First of all, we got into some arguments over there saying, well, the UN gives this money directly to NGOs as well as other countries through the form of education, increasing literacy rates, allowing for more infrastructure and also tourism. And my opponent responded, well, tourism, he tried to turn that. And then he also said, well, the amount of funding by the IMF and World Bank are decreasing. Again, we look to the framework of the debate, and that's whether or not the UN is A, useful, and B, fulfilling its vision statement. By any amount of funding is going towards being useful, because if the UN didn't exist, none of that funding would be going toward these countries. And second of all, the reason why the UN is useful is because of the fact that tourism, I would argue, is in fact a useful thing because it promotes the infrastructure and jobs in a certain market, and more funding is never a bad thing. So as long as the UN is doing things that are helping countries in Africa and helping more third world countries, it's in fact useful because that funding would completely go away in an affirmative world. The second idea is this idea of peacekeepers. And again, we both agree on this idea that peacekeepers, we can't really weigh when they've been good or bad. So the overall impact calculus that I've provided is the idea that not only do peacekeepers have a chance of diminishing the conflict that exists at that current time, but more importantly, peacekeepers allow for stability to be maintained in that region for decades to come because of the fact that they train police forces as well as military enforcers. Insofar as peacekeepers are the most important reason, because the fact that they train the military and the police, there is no other alternative in an affirmative world because you completely withdraw the idea of peacekeepers. In a useful world, or where peacekeepers are being useful, I would say that if they're providing any sort of training or aiding to the stability of a region, then they are in fact useful. And the third idea is this idea of the UN Security Council. And we come to this disagreement where we say, well, vetoes, you can have vetoes in the time of crisis. Well, I would say that vetoes are, first of all, not used as much as they should be if they actually were to evade crises. But the most recent crises that we've seen, whether it be North Korea or North Korea, which would be the most important one right now, has directly been addressed by China and the United States, insofar as China should have vetoed that because China has a vested economic interest in North Korea itself. but because I show you that the 15 countries working together make countries such as China want to vote for the UN Security Council, because even if they're proposing resolutions, those resolutions have immediate impact as a result of sanctions in North Korea. So for those three reasons, because we're promoting economic development, we're allowing peacekeepers to promote stability in the region for years to come, and because the United Nations Security Council takes actions that immediately impact the world, I see a useful and necessary importance of the UN in the current world.
All right, I have like 5 seconds, so vote pro.
Yeah, thanks for a great debate. And again, I'd just like to remind the audience that this wasn't a matter of providing examples. It's looking at the holistic impact of what the UN does. If you truly believe that the UN is not useful and doesn't actually promote worldwide stability, go ahead and vote for my opponent. But if you think that the UN is actually doing good in the world, then you vote con in today's debate and allow